Before we begin, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It might surprise you how many of us are following this story at the exact same moment, connected by one mystery that has lasted for decades. It was December 1944. The forests of Belgium were heavy with snow, silence broken only by the distant thud of artillery. The world called it the Ardennes, but the men who fought there would come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war, and in the chaos of that winter, thousands of soldiers vanished into history. Among them, 5 young Americans inside a Sherman tank they'd nicknamed Detroit Steel. For decades, their names were carved into marble as missing in action, another set of faces in the endless roster of World War II's lost. But what really happened to them? And why did their story resurface 40 years later, when farmers stumbled on something buried deep in the Belgian woods? This is a forgotten journey of the crew of Detroit Steel, a story of courage, disappearance, and the long road home. The 5 men who made up the crew of Detroit Steel were barely out of their teens when they were sent to Europe. The commander, Lieutenant John Jack Mercer, was just 24, the kind of man whose calm voice could settle the nerves of a whole unit. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a steelworker, and carried himself with a steady confidence that came from watching his father's quiet endurance. His crew trusted him completely, even when shells were falling and the ground shook beneath their treads. Beside him was Corporal Frank Delaney, the gunner. At 22, Frank had a mischievous smile and a sharp eye. Back in Chicago, he had been a machinist, always tinkering with engines, always certain he could fix whatever broke. The war gave him a bigger machine to master, the tank's 75mm gun. He once joked in a letter home that the cannon was his new steel sweetheart. Private William "Billy" Carter manned the driver's seat. 19 years old, freckle-faced, and barely 150 pounds, Billy was the youngest of them all. He wrote letters to his high school sweetheart every week, each one folded neatly into envelopes he hoped would be waiting when he returned. In the middle of battle, he gripped the controls with a mix of fear and determination, steering the tank like a farmer guides a stubborn mule. In the loader's position was Joseph Romano, 23, from Brooklyn. Joe was loud, brash, always talking about the corner deli his family ran. He dreamed of going back to the smell of fresh bread, the sound of church bells in the neighborhood. The guys teased him for sneaking salami into the field rations, but when the nights were cold and long, everyone was grateful for the extra bite. And finally, Staff Sergeant Henry "Hank" Walker, the radio operator. 25, a steady southern voice from Alabama. Hank was the anchor of the group, always reminding the others that no matter how far from home they weren't alone. He carried a small Bible in his breast pocket, its leather cover worn soft from constant handling. Together they were more than crew. They were a family, bound by steel, mud, and the ever-present shadow of death. In December, their orders were to push into the Ardennes, to hold the line against what no one realized was the last great German offensive. The forests were labyrinths of trees, snow muffling sound, fog rolling thick between branches. Tanks crawled like blind beasts, their engines echoing in valleys that swallowed both noise and men. On the morning of December 18th, Detroit Steel rolled out with the rest of their unit. Visibility was poor. Reports of German paratroopers behind the lines had everyone on edge. The radio crackled with half-heard commands, static mixing with voices that sounded almost ghostly. Hank leaned closer to the set, straining to catch each word, while Jack gave Billy a nod to keep moving. The column snaked down a narrow road, flanked by frozen pines. Somewhere out ahead, artillery thundered. Joe slid another shell into the breach. Frank adjusted the sights, and Billy tightened his grip on the controls. They were ready for anything, or at least they thought they were. By midday, snow began to fall harder. The world shrank to the glow of the periscope, the hum of the engine, and the creak of steel plates shifting with each bump. Jack ordered a halt. He climbed out briefly, scanning the tree line. In the silence, he could hear distant engines, not theirs. German armor was moving nearby. What happened next would be pieced together only from fragments. Survivors from other units remembered hearing gunfire, seeing flashes in the woods, then nothing. When roll was called at dusk, Detroit Steel was gone. No smoke, no wreckage, no sign of struggle. Just 5 names missing from the roster. For weeks, the army searched. Patrols combed the woods. Villagers were questioned. Even prisoners of war were asked if they had seen an American tank vanish. Nothing. The winter swallowed them whole. When the war ended, families were told the same thing. Missing in action. Mothers clutched telegrams. Wives cried into folded flags. Children grew up never knowing exactly what had happened. In Ohio, Jack's parents kept his bedroom untouched, a shrine to the boy who never came home. In Brooklyn, Joe's mother lit candles every Sunday. Pray her son might still walk through the door. Years passed. Decades. Memorials were built. Anniversaries observed. But for these 5 men, closure never came. Then came the summer of 1984. A farmer clearing land near the Belgian town of Bastogne noticed something unusual. The dry season pulled back the earth, revealing twisted steel jutting from the ground. Curious, he dug with his tractor, then stopped when he realized what he had uncovered. Rusted tracks. An American star faintly visible beneath layers of soil and moss. A tank. Authorities were called, and soon a team of investigators and military historians arrived. What they unearthed was astonishing. Buried almost completely beneath earth and roots was a Sherman tank, sealed by time. The locals whispered that it had been entombed deliberately, hidden from view for reasons no one could explain. When the hatch was pried open, the air was thick and stale, untouched since 1944. Inside lay the remains of 5 men, still in uniform, their positions frozen as if waiting for orders. The radio at Hank's station was smashed, the barrel of the gun still loaded with an unused shell. Billy's hands were skeletal bones wrapped around the controls, his head slumped forward. It was Detroit steel. The discovery sent shockwaves through both Belgium and the United States. Newspapers carried the story. Lost tank found after 40 years. Families who had lived with uncertainty were suddenly thrust back into grief, confronted with the undeniable truth of what had happened. Yet questions remained. How had the tank ended up buried? Why hadn't it been found earlier? Some speculated that in the chaos of the battle, the crew drove into a bomb crater and were trapped. Others suggested the Germans, realizing the tank was immobilized, had covered it with earth to hide it. There were even whispers of more sinister explanations, that something about the disappearance didn't match the usual patterns of war. Forensic teams examined the remains carefully. There were no bullet holes in the armor, no evidence of fire. The crew had likely suffocated, sealed inside as oxygen ran out. A slow, silent death beneath the soil of a foreign land. When word reached the families back in America, the impact was overwhelming. Jack's younger sister, now an old woman, wept as she told reporters, "At least now we can bring him home." Joe's nephews, grown men who had only known him through faded photographs, traveled to Belgium to witness the recovery. For them, it was like opening a time capsule that should never have been buried. The U.S. Army arranged for the remains to be repatriated in 1985. Flags draped over coffins. Solemn ceremonies held in hometowns across the country. In Chicago, Frank was buried with full honors, a 21-gun salute echoing over the cemetery. In Alabama, Hank's Bible was placed on top of his casket, finally at rest in southern soil. For Billy, the youngest, his high school sweetheart, now a grandmother, stood at the graveside and whispered, "I told you I'd wait." For a moment, history gave back what it had stolen. The story of Detroit Steel could have ended there, neatly closed after 40 years of silence. But for those who had lived with the mystery, and for those who uncovered it, questions still linger like smoke after a battlefield. What had those final hours inside the tank been like? Did the men know their fate as the soil closed in around them? Military historians pieced together fragments. Reports from German units in the area mentioned ambushes along the narrow roads. Some speculated that Detroit Steel had been disabled by a hidden mine or an artillery strike that jammed the treads. Trapped and immobile, the men may have tried to hold out, their radio smashed in the attempt to send one last desperate call for help. When rescue never came, and when German forces advanced, the tank might have been deliberately covered to hide its existence. Others believed something different, that nature itself had entombed the crew. In that brutal winter, the ground was torn by shell fire, collapsing roads and swallowing vehicles whole. Perhaps the Sherman slid into a crater, snow and mud sealing it off, erasing it from sight as though the earth itself conspired to bury the men where they fell. Whatever the truth, the 5 soldiers had been together in life and together in death, their loyalty lasting far beyond the battlefield. That unbroken bond became the heart of the story, and perhaps the reason it resonated so deeply with people decades later. When the tank was transported back to the United States for further study, crowds gathered to watch. Veterans in their 70s stood at attention, saluting the rusted hulk as if it were still rumbling with life. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Why did it take so long to find them? Why didn't anyone know? At Fort Knox, where the remains of Sherman tanks are preserved, curators spoke about the rarity of such a discovery. Usually we find wreckage, one explained, pieces scattered, burned-out shells. But this was whole. It's like a tomb sealed by time itself. Documentarians began filming, weaving the men's letters and photos into a narrative that bridged the gap between 1944 and 1984. Old black and white snapshots showed them smiling, arms around each other, unaware of the fate that awaited. Reading their words aloud, actors gave voice to the long-dead soldiers, and audiences wept at the humanity behind the history. Back in Ohio, Jack Mercer's family home became a place of pilgrimage. His sister kept the telegrams, the medals, and now the folded flag that draped his coffin. Neighbors would sit with her on the porch and listen as she spoke about Jack's childhood. How he once built a treehouse strong enough to hold all the neighborhood kids. How he always insisted on being the last one to leave so no one felt abandoned. That was Jack, she'd say. He always stayed with his men. In Chicago, Frank Delaney's story became part of local history. His old machine shop hung a photograph of him, smiling in uniform, above the workbench where he had once learned to shape metal. Workers said it was a reminder that their craft, the shaping of steel, had been carried into battle by one of their own. For Billy Carter, the youngest, his name was added to a memorial at his high school. At graduation ceremonies, teachers would pause to remind students of the 19-year-old who had once walked those halls, dreaming of a future that war had stolen. His sweetheart, now white-haired, attended quietly each year, laying a single rose beneath his plaque. And in Brooklyn, Joe Romano's family finally stopped setting an empty place at Sunday dinner. Instead, they raised a glass in his honor, telling stories of the boy who had made them laugh even in the darkest times. The deli he once bragged about had long since closed, but the smell of bread and coffee still lingered in memory. For Hank Walker, his Bible, the one found still tucked in his uniform, was returned to his family. His granddaughter, who had never met him, held it close as though it contained the missing chapters of the story she had always longed to hear. The recovery of Detroit steel also reignited debates about how war remembers its dead. For some, the story was a reminder of how many families never received closure. Thousands of names still marked as missing in action. Men whose bodies were never recovered, whose fates remain mysteries. For others, it was a tale of loyalty and fate, of 5 men bound by duty who refused to be separated even in death. When veterans gathered to speak of them, voices often cracked with emotion. "We used to say no man gets left behind," one elderly soldier explained. But the truth is, sometimes they do. Sometimes the war swallows them. And when we find them, even years later, it feels like we kept our promise after all. In Belgium, near the spot where the tank was uncovered, locals erected a small monument, a polished plaque with 5 names engraved in English and French: Mercer, Delaney, Carter, Romano, Walker. Each year, on the anniversary of the discovery, villagers placed flowers there, even though the soldiers were strangers from another land. To them, it is a reminder that war scars not just soldiers, but the soil itself. The site has become a quiet place of pilgrimage for tourists, history enthusiasts, and descendants tracing their roots. Some leave coins, others leave flags, and sometimes on misty mornings, a lone bugler plays taps, the sound echoing across the trees where the tank once lay hidden. Decades after their recovery, the story of Detroit steel is still told, in classrooms, in documentaries, and around dinner tables. It is not the story of generals and strategies, but of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances. Men who laughed, argued, dreamed, and disappeared, only to be remembered by the chance turn of a farmer's plow. Their tale reminds us that history is not just written in books, but buried in the ground, waiting to be uncovered. That behind every statistic of war is a face, a voice, a family who waits for answers. As we close this chapter, imagine those 5 men in their final moments. The tank still, the air thinning, the ground pressing in. Perhaps they prayed. Perhaps they cursed. Perhaps they simply looked at one another, drawing strength from the only family they had left. In that silence, they remained together, and together, they waited for the world to find them again. Today, their names are spoken not just as soldiers lost, but as men found, not as ghosts, but as brothers. The earth that once buried them now tells their story to anyone who will listen. And so we remember. If you've stayed with us through this journey, take a moment to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this story. Because stories like this, stories of courage, sacrifice, and mystery, deserve to be told. They remind us that even when time tries to bury the past, truth has a way of breaking through the soil. This was the story of Detroit Steel, the tank that vanished in 1944, only to be found 40 years later, sealed, silent, but never forgotten.